Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College.
I think that's the whole importance of storytelling. And Jesus Christ was the best storyteller ever with his parables.
Right.
And I think C.S. Lewis and other writers who've taken complex, difficult topics, put it in story form, then it touches our heart. God's wired us for story.
And I've heard it said in apologetic circles now, as we've made this shift to a post-Christian setting, we used to use argument to get people to see the beauty and goodness of Christ. And actually, we need to flip the script a bit and show them the beauty and the goodness, and then they'll see the truth.
Right.
And when you're reading someone like any one of the Wade authors, I think they do such a good job of that.
Welcome to the Wade podcast. We are joined this morning by Joel Woodruff, who is president of the C.S. Lewis Institute, and Karl Johnson, who is director of the C.S. Lewis Institute in Chicago. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's our pleasure to be with you,
Good to
Crystal,
be here.
David.
Joel, why don't you start us off by giving us a brief history of the C.S. Lewis Institute?
Sure.
Who started it? When?
The Institute was started in 1976, 44 years ago now, by Dr. James Houston, who was in a Bible study with C.S. Lewis and also started Regent College in Vancouver, British Columbia. And Jim Hiskey is the other co-founder. He was, believe it or not, a pro golfer, started the Bible study in the PGA Tour. And both of them saw a need for professional people in the workplace who were believers to be able to better live out and share their faith in Jesus Christ. Oftentimes they felt they had a Sunday school education and they just didn't feel competent in talking about Christ in the workplace. And so it was an attempt to begin to bridge that gap and be a servant ministry to the church.
And KJ, how did you get involved with the C.S. Lewis Institute?
Well, in my previous life, I was an active duty Marine officer, and I was stationed in the D.C. area where the Institute has been for the preponderance of its history. And while I was stationed in that area, a friend of mine handed me a set of CDs back when we listened to those things, and it was titled The Spiritual Formation of C.S. Lewis by a guy we all know and love, Lyle Dorsett, former director of the Wade Center, among many other things. And I was just blown away. And I thought, well, where did this come from? And I looked a little closer at the packaging, and it was a lecture series from the C.S. Lewis Institute. And, well, these guys are right up the road, and this is pre-Google and those things. So I just started getting involved and attending, and then I participated in their one-year C.S. Lewis Fellows program, which is a year-long, pretty intensive discipleship program. And the rest is history. I just never went away. They couldn't get rid of me.
That's right.
And when did you get involved, Joel?
I got involved in about 2009. Dr. Tom Terrence was the president of the C.S. Lewis Institute at the time, and got to know him through church, and we ended up doing some teaching together. And I began teaching in their Fellows program, which is the year-long discipleship program, kind of the flagship
the one
program
that KJ was just talking about.
And so it was through that initial introduction, and then Carrie Knott became the president in 2010, and had a desire, felt the Lord saying, if people were interested in bringing the C.S. Lewis Institute to their another city, to be open to that. And so they brought me on in about 2011 to help us with the growth of the ministry.
So how many cities have chapters of the C.S. Lewis Institute?
So we're now in 16 cities, 13 in the U.S. We're in Toronto, Canada, Belfast, Northern Ireland. So we've been spreading out just kind of 2 or 3 at a time as the Lord brings people to us.
Being fruitful and multiplying.
That's right. So, and then we're doing some pilot programs the past year and a half in India and in Kenya. So, and really it's all about discipleship of heart and mind, in which C.S. Lewis is all about. Jim Houston, our co-founder, said we're not a fan club of C.S. Lewis, but we'd love to raise up 10,000 like him. And so that's the idea, really, to develop people, men and women who are wholehearted disciples of Jesus Christ, who really are able to articulate, defend, share, and live their faith in both their personal life, but also make an impact in their public life.
Yeah, one distinction I like to draw sometimes is there's so many C.S. Lewis societies and things like that. We get confused with them, and I'll say first, we're the only one that bears the name Institute. And in one sense, while we join in these other organizations in wanting to preserve and celebrate the legacy of Lewis, we have, as we were talking pre-podcast about a forward-looking, we're one of the institutions focused on living out the legacy of Lewis, which is pointing people to the work and person of Jesus Christ and helping them become more like Jesus Christ in the process, because that's Lewisian through and through.
It is.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, he said that in the letter. He said, I'm turning 50. Where is the next generation of people that are going to carry on my legacy? He didn't want people to simply make him the anchor by which spiritual formation was going to progress the next 50 years or so. So I'm glad you're you're picking up that legacy.
Yeah, I think he would at first cringe if he knew there was an organization bearing his name. But if we
multiple organizations,
but if we cast it like that, I think that would give him some peace of mind. Going, okay, all right.
How would he feel if he knew I had a bust on my desk where he's wearing a cap that says Aslan's on the move? You know,
that's pretty amazing.
When the movies came out, my students all gave me Aslan chapstick and Aslan caps, and I had all the paraphernalia and all the swag.
Well, I know that you sponsor conferences, and how do those operate? Do you try to have one every year, or does every different chapter become responsible for organizing its own conferences?
Yeah, every city organizes events in their city, and our tend to do conferences that are based on topics of apologetics, discipleship, evangelism, we'll say a C.S. Lewisian flavor. In other words, the integration of the mind and heart and reason and imagination. So we're blessed. Over the years, even used a number of people here at the Wade Center at Wheaton College to speak at our conferences, and been very grateful for over the years the partnership and that, and as people have spoken in different cities.
Yeah, I know here in Chicago, I've tried to capitalize on issues of the day. Several years ago, we had one of Ravi's speakers come in town to speak on do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? But we've had our friend Jerry Root many times. He teaches for us every year in our Fellows program, but we had him do a talk based on his book on Lewis and the imagination, and he did a talk for us, the use and abuse of imagination, which was wonderful. So
yeah, we've been blessed. Our C.S. Lewis Institutes have popped up in all different cities, and it's one in Annapolis, Maryland, for instance. And so we do events at the U.S. Naval Academy on apologetics. We had John Lennox there not too long ago, an apologist from Oxford, and then he'll come to Washington, D.C. and speak there. And so we're able to, through different venues, we tend to mix up our venues as well, local churches, university campuses, and get the good news out about Jesus Christ ultimately. But Lewis has a way of attracting people, the name. So so when we do our events, I think C.S. Lewis's name brings out people who are interested in going deeper.
Even though the conferences aren't always about Lewis,
That's
right?
correct.
It's much more about discipleship, spiritual formation, following the example of Lewis, rather than being scholarship about Lewis.
Yeah, I like this to say sometimes that some of the topics we touch on might be the sorts of things Lewis would either talk about at the pub with the guys or might write about if it was an issue of the day, like that one on Islam and Christianity. I could see him writing on that as a point of confusion if he were alive today.
Yes, that's right.
We were trying to decide what to call all these different cities. Let me suggest sleeper cells. Is that
there we go.
They're all over the place. You don't know where they're going to pop up.
Yeah. That's a good idea.
The NSA just tuned in.
Yeah, that's
right. I wanted to ask about your individual spiritual journeys and how was Lewis a key part of a milestone in your individual spiritual journeys, or did you just already feel pretty well anchored in faith when you discovered Lewis?
In my case, I grew up in a Christian home and believing parents was blessed to come to know Christ at a young age. But it's really actually coming to Wheaton College where Lewis became a bigger part of my life and faith, and found his writings and, of course, in the teaching here at Wheaton.
Was Clyde Kilby still teaching when you were here?
No, he wasn't at that point in time, but I had some wonderful people in both the English department and theology department. Lewis, well, as you all probably know, anytime there's a chapel talk at Wheaton, you have to quote C.S. Lewis, the patron saint. So, but it did help develop my faith, I think, and then later on as an adult, began to appreciate him all that much more.
Yeah, I grew up pseudo-Christian home, and I had a pretty good foundation. And I read Screw Tape Letters early on, and I think they took a root in me more deeply than I realized. And then I went off and sowed some wild oats, so to speak. And then as I came back around to take my faith more seriously, Lewis factored back in because my faith up till that point was more emotive. And it was really an emotional state back and forth. And he provided that much needed intellectual rigor and got me thinking. So it was really being transformed by the renewing of my mind. And he was a huge piece of that. He scared me at first. I should have not have picked up the abolition of man first because I dropped and went, But I came back around, it went into mere Christianity, and it was, I've been in love with Lewis ever since. He's been really, really helpul. I think the book that impacted me the most, though, was Miracles. That one was really helpful.
Why do you think
I feel like his arguments there, it was the first time I really heard some really winsome, powerful arguments that were intellectually driven, but weren't just intellectualism, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that to be really refreshing.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems as though God was preparing Lewis in a special way, insofar as he started out as a philosophy major at Oxford, of course, and then went into English, so he can grapple with philosophical issues like miracles, but then had enough literary background that served him to write science fiction novels, even children's literature. So it's unusual to have that type of combination in a writer.
That's a great observation.
Right.
My undergrad was in English, and some of my frustration, I felt like later in life, as I got more philosophically minded, was that sometimes some of that grounding just seemed to be missing, some of the logic, some of the thought process. So I think it's a really good observation.
Crystal studies Dorothy Sayers and writes books on Dorothy L. Sayers. The book Miracles had an odd origin. She did her radio plays on Man Born to Be King. She Sayers. On it was 12 plays on the life of Christ in the vernacular. And she had this one cranky old skeptic who wrote her and said, "Do you really believe in the supernatural and miracles? I thought you were educated." And it was a very insulting letter. So she wrote to Lewis about it and said, "This isn't the kind of letter I want to tackle. Are you interested in responding to this fellow? You like souls. I don't." And then Lewis wrote back and said, "I'm starting a book on miracles."
No, but she said somebody needs to write a book on miracles in the letter. And 4 days later, he said, "I'm starting a book on miracles."
That's wonderful. That's
so
neat.
Sayers is real key. And of course, he identified Sayers as an important part of his spiritual life when he was interviewed, close to the end of his life.
Yeah, that's powerful.
So I'm supposed to be the one who introduces Sayers into the conversation.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
You
normally that's
usurped me.
Crystal's role to
There we
make
go.
sure
That's
that...
right. That's great.
Well done.
That's great.
Right.
Did you want to bring in Harriet Tubman or anyone else
No.
into the conversation? Oh, okay.
I almost thought you were going to say Harry Potter there.
That would be good
well,
too. Yeah.
we do have some scholars who look at the development of fantasy fiction, and a lot of people think of Tolkien as the father of fantasy fiction, but we would say you could go back to George MacDonald, who is also archived here at the Wade, who was writing these bizarre accounts, which I think come close to fantasy.
Sure.
And Tolkien read MacDonald, right?
He did, yes.
Sure.
Yes, and of course we know that Lewis said that he probably quotes MacDonald in everything
Every single
he's
word. Right.
ever published.
Amazing.
That's
I wanted
pretty
to ask,
amazing.
It is.
Pretty good.
It's a great endorsement.
What sort of obstacles you run into? I just was doing some talks on mere Christianity, and he prepared for those radio lectures by speaking to RAF personnel during the first summer of the war, and he was surprised. He said when he used the word creature, he meant created by God, and they thought animal, like all creatures, great and small.
Yes.
And he said when he talked about sin or moral deficiency, they said, well, isn't that just social problems if we educate people better? And they didn't have an idea of personal sin or personal failing.
Right.
And part of the reason in Mere Christianity, he starts that entire first section talking about the moral law.
Yes.
And he says, we've all heard quarreling. Everybody has a standard which they think the other person's not living up to.
Right.
And what he's trying to do is give them a conviction of sin before he can move on to the gospel. What sort of challenges do you run into with today's audiences? It's in a way, it's not a pristine audience. When Paul got up at Mars Hill, this was the first they'd heard of the good news. Nowadays, we live in a post-Christian culture, and people have a lot of stereotypes and opinions.
Right.
Do you
And
feel
hence
that you have
resistance.
to sort of finesse the gospel in a different way when people think they know what you're going to say before you do it?
Now, that's an excellent question. I know in the D.C. area, where we're headquartered to CSOS2, we have found that the population in general is less biblically literate. So maybe there's so just knowing Bible characters and knowledge, kind of things that actually I think in Western culture were just known even through Shakespeare, are not as prevalent anymore. So we do have to be more precise, perhaps, in our language. The gospel is always the same, but the way we communicate is be sure that it's clear. And but I think we are finding that's one of the issues as well. I think we're finding differences in the generation. So when with baby boomers, older audiences, they are more familiar with certain things of the gospel. The younger ones maybe not so much. So But I think we are finding that when we do apologetics events in particular, things like dealing with the supernatural, and that Lewis addresses, and many of Lewis's arguments actually still have a lot of relevance today and are really touching people. So we're amazingly, I think Lewis is very prophetic in much of what he has said, in Abolition of Man and other places. So we're finding that he's still helpful. I don't know about you, KJ, here in Chicago, what you found?
He was a man ahead of his time. Those arguments are very relevant and timely today. I think there's some advantages and disadvantages to the post-Christian culture. There are some stereotypes that we need to overcome, maybe from some of the ways we as Christians have not behaved as well as we should have. And so now the word Christian or evangelical or things like that have come with a certain baggage. But there's also, with being post-Christian, and Barna's research has been bearing this out, especially with the younger generations, is actually there's less resistance because they have no frame of reference.
Right.
And if we're, so it's almost like we're getting back a little bit to a cleaner slate in some ways where we can actually set a tone. But there is a lot of the antagonism you're talking about. It's still, I'd say that's still the prevalent response because bigoted and things like that, whether it's the way we have traditionally dealt with race here in the United States, which hasn't always been what we should, sexuality, et cetera. So there is we do have to overcome some of those things. And this is something we were talking about Max pre-podcast as well. Max is a master at this, Max McLean, with his performances. And he said the way he is able to weave conversations after this storytelling, sometimes I think we need to take a lead on that, is less argument up front and get past those watchful dragons so we can get past some of those assumptions. Because once you get someone engaged in dialogue, then it's so much easier to touch on these things.
Right. Well, and that is an insight Lewis made clear, that his imagination had to be baptized first in order to prepare him for a more intellectual appropriation of Christian doctrine. So how can we baptize the imagination of this generation? And of course, they're watching the Narnia movies, the Tolkien movies, and that can just get them started thinking. And as you were talking, KJ, I thought how, in a way, it almost could be easier responding to someone who's antagonistic, because you can ask them, well, what are your objections? And then you could deal with their objections and say, well, here's what actually Christians say. I understand, that some have warped the message. What I find harder is those who say, oh, you have Christ, I have Buddha, and I'm so glad you're happy and I'm happy, and all religions lead to God. And then to say, well, it may not be that simple.
Well, that and apathy. Another one is there's just a strong movement of apathy these days of, well, that works for you, that's great. And there's not that sense of need of, I need that. And I think being engaged, or at least aware of culture, is so helpful. One post-Christian engagement I had about 8 or 10 years ago was an argument on my wife's side of the family, and we were called in to be peacemakers. And so I sat quietly while my wife was stepping in, and she tried to make an allusion to Old Testament Joseph, and it just fell completely flat. And after about 5 minutes of her then trying to reframe it so they understood the point, I just finally said, Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and they went, oh yeah,
there you go, there it is.
And then the conversation. So having some cultural awareness is really, and so that takes imagination, and I think that is something we need to reinvigorate imaginations these days. Which is why I like Jerry's book, Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis, is so helpful in the different ways Lewis used imagination, because it's not monolithic.
It's scary, though, how they get their information from popular culture. Do you think anybody thinks from Jesus Christ Superstar that Jesus had a great singing voice?
Yeah, that's right. That's great, yes.
And was remarkably
You're dating
good
yourself,
looking.
David. I'm not sure many of them would
that's right.
have access to that. KJ, I'm so glad you mentioned Max McLean, because the Wade has invited him to come do his most reluctant convert here at Wheaton College this next academic year. And we saw him do his performance in Colorado Springs when we were out there with family. And what I found so evocative is his ability to start with Lewis's atheism and
Yes.
develop just this
Yes.
great apologetic for why an intelligent person has to be an atheist. How could you be intelligent and not? And then he slowly takes it apart and ends with faith. I mean, it's just absolutely
genius.
No, he does a masterful job with that.
Right.
And we were privileged to do a podcast with him here at the Wade.
That's great. We're finding, I think, too, in regards to all this, the importance of asking good questions and developing a conversational apologetics approach to life, really, and with people. We use Dr. Randy Newman's book, Questioning Evangelism, one of our C.S. Lewis Institute teaching fellows. But the idea, I think, is anytime we meet someone, we need to find out where they're at. And I think that's the problem. In the past, we assumed they had a certain level of biblical understanding or even culture or Judeo-Christian thinking. But now I think it's so important to ask questions, find out where they're at, what they believe, and then ask them questions about why they believe what they believe. And that's when things begin to unravel. And I think also gives us opportunities then to present the gospel in just a loving, thoughtful, gracious way.
Yeah, I have a feeling that's how Lewis would have been in person. If you sat down, he would take a keen interest in you.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. Francis Schaeffer had once said that if he only had an hour with a person, he'd spend 55 minutes listening and asking questions. So in the last 5 minutes, he would know what to say. And I just get the sense that's very much like something like Lewis or Tolkien or one of these guys, because they were engaging with one another. It wasn't just preaching at one another.
Right.
No, that's right.
And arguing at times.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
One time, Harry Emerson Fosdick was preaching. This is a 19th century preacher. And a heckler got up and said, "I don't believe in God." They said, "Well, tell me about this God you don't believe in." "Chances are I don't believe in him either." And I thought that was an interesting way to engage.
Right.
Yeah,
this
that's
person.
great.
Yeah,
It is.
you
Yes,
almost
that's
have to
right.
level
You do.
the playing field because people are arguing about different things,
No, that's
really.
right.
I thought that was
Yeah.
very insightful. And remind me of the opening line, David, of Mere Christianity. It's just so down to earth.
He starts out saying, we've all heard people quarreling. Sometimes it's funny and sometimes it's annoying, but there's always the same pattern that they each have a standard of right that they're appealing to. And someone says, that's not fair. The other one doesn't say, well, I don't care about your fairness. They say, no, it is fair because this. And I think the reason he does that is he wants people to find the foundation for their belief in their own consciousness and their own soul, rather than arguments for the resurrection of Christ or historicity of this or that. He says, look into your own heart. I think you will find the moral law there. Where did that moral law come from?
Yes.
But I love the concrete opening. He was very good at openings.
Yes, he
Right.
was.
And that's the level playing field. We've
right.
all had quarrels. And so
That's
it's
right.
so brilliant. And here's this Oxford Don,
Yeah.
and yet he knows enough to get it down to something we can all identify with, rather than saying, well, let's talk about our theories of an absolute. How can you believe in the good unless you think there is an absolute behind the good? No, he gets us
That's
down to something we can identify with.
That's right.
I remember sometimes I would have students who would say of their professors, wow, that professor is so brilliant, I can't understand a thing he says. And I always responded, if he were brilliant,
Yes.
he would be able to make
Yes.
his or her field accessible to you.
Yeah.
So
That's what Lewis said, speaking in the vernacular.
Yes.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
right. But I think that's the whole importance of storytelling. And Jesus Christ was the best storyteller ever with his
Right,
parables.
right.
And I think C.S. Lewis and other writers who've taken complex, difficult topics, put it in story form, then it touches our heart. God's wired us for story. And I think we do, probably have, through inheriting the Enlightenment and Western philosophy, have gotten too much into kind of the Western, I guess we would say, putting things in compartments and
Right.
and organizing things systematically. Whereas in a Eastern Hebrew mind, you can live with a little more mystery. There's story. There's concrete people and time and history and space. And I think we can learn a lot from that and using storytelling a lot better in the way we present the truth.
Yeah, we're a little more on the rationalism at times.
We are,
and
yeah.
and I've heard it said in apologetic circles now, as we've made this shift to a post-Christian setting, we used to use argument to get people to see the beauty and goodness of Christ. And actually, we need to flip the script a
Yes.
bit
Yes, that's
and
right.
show them the beauty and the goodness, and then they'll see the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that's just, and when you're reading someone like any one of the Wade authors, for example, I mean, we keep talking about Lewis, but it could be Chesterton or whatnot. I think they do such a good job of that. Or reading even some of early MacDonald, Day Boy, Night Girl, things like that. And you see these wonderful stories, and then it just enters you, allows you to enter into this world. And then you start to see the truth rather than leading with the truth sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
No, that's right.
Earlier, I was thinking of Chesterton. When Crystal, you talked about, that's fine for you, whatever works for you. Chesterton said, a cosmic philosophy needs to be big enough to fill the whole cosmos, not just a man's head. And
good.
I thought that was a clever way to say it.
Yeah.
It should be
Very
some
good.
correlation to reality. It shouldn't just be what feels emotionally satisfying for an individual person.
Yes, no, that's right.
The quotable Chesterton is very quotable.
Yeah, he's very, very pretty amazing.
Some of them, they sound profound. I'm not sure they actually make any sense. He said, art like morality is knowing where to draw the line. And
That's great. That's right.
I don't know what it means, but
not
it's
an awful lot has been written about cheese or something like that.
exactly.
Yes.
Opening,
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's very good.
So smart.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome.
Why don't you tell me the first time you visited the Wade? How did you happen to come here, and tell me your impressions?
Well, my first visit to the Wade was when it was actually located in the, I think the Buswell Library, I believe, on the top floor. And my grandmother, Woodruff, lived here in Wheaton, and she'd grown up in a fundamentalist Christian home, godly lady, but she had certain things you didn't do, like smoke, drink, she would go with girls to do.
Right.
And I remember walking up to the Wade Center the first time with her and walking in the door, and there's a big picture of C.S. Lewis smoking a pipe.
I know.
And she had heard so many wonderful things about C.S. Lewis and read about him and heard, and it almost knocked her over, smoking a pipe. But then she eventually settled down and was, okay, I guess that would be okay. That was my first remembrance of walking in the Wade Center. But I remember it was actually, in my day at Wheaton College, was the place, if you really wanted to study, it was a quiet place to come study. So I spent some time there. But it was a beautiful, it was a good place to get introduced to Lewis at that time.
Yeah.
I published a book called Most Reluctant Convert. I cover some of the same ground that Max McLean did in his play Most Reluctant Convert. But on the cover, they had a famous picture of him sitting there holding a cigarette. Came out from InterVarsity. At a lot of Christian bookstores, they put a label over the cigarette that said, new from InterVarsity. They didn't want to. And if you look on Google now, people have actually photoshopped the cigarette out of the picture.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it looks like he's doing a gang sign because his
that one looks
fingers are like this.
Hey, bro.
Yeah.
The Vulcan thing.
I know.
Yeah.
My mom, I asked, she was also similar to your grandmother in that I asked, why didn't you give me the Narnia Chronicles when I was a kid? And she said, well, Lewis, he drank and he smoked and he was an Anglican, so how spiritual could he be, So we all had to overcome that in our generation.
Yes.
Yeah.
How about you, Casey?
You're right. It's a special place. For me, I consider the Wade one of those thin places for me. When I come here, I just get a different feeling. I've been coming here for so long, I don't remember my first one, but my earliest memory is actually sitting in this office. I'd become friends with Chris Mitchell.
Oh, yes.
And whenever
who was the director before
the
David
director,
and I.
right. And I didn't live in Chicago. I was coming back. I was still active duty. And whenever I came back home, I'd make a stop in. And I remember coming in, sitting right here. And Chris was, he gets excitable and was, have you read this? Have you read? And but then Jerry Root was here. And I'd known of Jerry forever, but I had not met him. And this has got to be maybe 10 years ago now. And he was downstairs showing some students around, and he just, in his excitable manner, hey, KJ, have you met Jerry yet? I'm like, no, I have not. He's like, oh, he loves Marines. You got to meet him. So let's go. And he hustled me downstairs, and I met Jerry, and then Jerry gave me that back-crunching bear hug that he does and lifted me off the ground. And I've been in love with Jerry Root ever since. So that's my earliest.
Everybody who
memory.
meets Jerry is falls in love with him.
His dad was a Marine in World War II and carries a lot of shrapnel. So I wanted to ask the question, maybe this is a different podcast, how an English major prepared me to become a Marine. Wouldn't that be a good topic?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah. I've made a lot of crazy left-hand turns in my life.
So tell us, do you have any upcoming events you would like to share with us?
Actually, we do have one that we're excited about. April 25th in Washington, D.C. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Fellows Program of the C.S. Lewis Institute. Over 4,000 people have gone through this year-long discipleship program. And so if you'd like to find out more information about it, you can go to our website, cslewisinstitute.org.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us and having a conversation about the C.S. Lewis Institute and your involvement. And we are just so glad to have connection with you.
No, it's mutual. We've been so grateful for the Wade Center and the connection with you all personally and over the years. And so thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Yeah, I love, personally, I've had a love affair with the Wade Center before I was with the C.S. Lewis Institute. And it's just nice to be here contributing and being a part of the Wade in whatever way. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave a review on iTunes and especially tell your friends. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, and our resources, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.